Thank you for joining us for one of two artist conversations this afternoon. My name is Eva Kozeneka. I have the pleasure of leading a small program at Google called Artists and Machine Intelligence with my colleague Kenrick McDowell. And today, I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Martha Fiennes, artist, writer, filmmaker.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Many of you may have already seen Eugen in the atrium. Eugen is the most recent film directed and produced by Martha. It premiered last year at the Venice International Film Festival and has since screened at the Serpentine Gallery, at LACMA, and of course now, as of last night, it's here in New York City at Christie's for the week ahead. We've prepared a short clip in case you haven't had time to spend many moments with it yet. We'll set the stage with a small excerpt. So the clip that we've just seen, a trailer in effect, it plays like a traditional film, but yet it's not. How do you describe it?
Well, the trailer is a traditional film, of course, yeah. But you mean the project as a whole? Yeah, well, I come from filmmaking, from traditional film practice. And this Eugen is actually the second piece I've made exploring what I call sort of expanding the boundaries of the traditional, actually really quite inert process, a highly controlling process of bolting sequences of image that you have controlled and chosen together with sound and really hard baking it in the oven. And it's, as we all know, that if you play a movie, it's always going to be the same again. So this, I've nicknamed it a sort of hybrid moving image or hybrid film media in which there are decision-making capabilities given by the machine, which releases the process from the controlled edit, which always has a fixed length and allows it to be ongoing, and it's also built on layers. And the work is also quite a hodgepodge of different modalities within the film practice. But in simple terms, it is it's been given freedom and it does things that I have no idea what they're going to do next, but of course I will recognize, I guess, the data input that I have put there sitting as potential at any one time.
And the specific technology that is powering the film is called Unity. It's a video game engine.
Absolutely. For Eugen, we adapted a Unity gaming engine. The decision was made that that would be the most sort of practical approach. My first work, which was made in 2011, an amazing coder built the code for it from the ground up. I don't think he slept, and he looked like a sort of emaciated sort of shadow of a human being by the end, poor guy. But this was actually, in some ways, there are little sort of restrictions by using something that's already created, but we didn't have that option all those years ago, but now we do.
Right, and to clarify for the audience, for those of you less familiar with Unity, it is a full stack software solution that allows you to create 2D and 3D VR and AR environments.
That's right.
It's an incredible resource then that you didn't have your hands on for the first film. How do you, it's something that I also like to mention is that it powers half of the world's video games, at least according to Unity's website. And something that's incredible is you're coming to this project as a filmmaker, but yet you're using a tool that has been designed for video game makers. How did you come across it and decide to leverage it in your work?
That's such a good question. I mean, I guess going back to the filmmaking process, much like the director, it's always an ambitious process. And I guess these pieces, they're ambitious. There's lots of scope within them. in that way, there are many different departments over which I exert creativity and influence. But I have departments so I can't claim to be the person who can talk in the deep tech. I go to my guys in the end of the post-production loading algorithm place, which happens actually at the very end of our process, and they are the ones who make those choices. And it's very interesting because there's so much creative work in this piece. And when you're working with creative people, they have different aspects to them from their different departments. You can imagine whether it's hair and makeup is very different to props, which is different to wardrobe, which is different to editing. Not that we edit in this. And the camera department, they're different guys altogether. And the coding guys, they're the whole different kind of type and feel and approach. So I noticed that they don't often see the work in the more creative way, the more visual. And I'm talking about meaning here. How do you extract meaning? What is, because that's an individual thing, isn't it? What means something to me might not mean the same to you. Mike's talk was fascinating in so many ways. Where do you find meaning from machines or the human touch? So,
did the conceit for Yugen come about first then, and the technology was a response to the vision that you wanted to put forward?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, I was given this offered this commission on the basis of the first work, but the first work definitely came from, and a sort of momentary inspiration of thinking, moving image is a very powerful experience. It's the tradition from which I come and have worked in. I also believe there are ways to expand that palette that isn't in the incredibly well-honed tram lines of that really quite massive industry. And so that was the force, was just the first thought was the inspiration for it must be possible. It must be, I kind of know it would be. And then you find the people to bring in the whole coordination to bring it together. And it is a huge experiment at the same time.
Yeah, and you've described it as a traditional film has, you start at point A and it takes you to a point B, point C, point D. In Yugen, it's more of a circular visualization, if you will.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it isn't this kind of, you go along, you have a beginning, middle, and an ending, and then it's over, and it's completely finished, and there's a sort of death, and you have to either go back to the beginning, but it's all going to be the same again. Yeah, this was an idea of cycles, but then changes within those cycles. It's also built on video layers, so there are some things that happen. The machine chooses to put something in foreground, background, make lighting changes, make audio choices. So it is traditional generative, I have to say that. But again, where is one putting the meaning of what the experience is from the range of filmmaking modalities? But yeah, to answer your question, it's released from that, and it's cycles and, in fact, generation and regeneration, you could say, in some ways, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear you unpack your process a little bit, because there are, in some ways, you do follow a more traditional filmmaking process with Yugen, and at other times you deviate. So I'm tempted to start with the very first question: is there a script at the beginning of the project?
Well, one of the things I find so exciting about working with this medium is I'm not in the very traditional coordinates of making film. And they are traditional, and because they cost money, and you generally have to have sign-off of a script, and everyone reads that script, and that's the benchmark, and of course it's going to change enormously. But you have all departments want to know exactly what's happening insofar as they possibly can. And a change to a script is, of course, there are plenty of directors who do, and everyone has a freak out because they wrote a whole new script during the night, and of course all those things happen. But with this, I found it so exciting to just trust that I was in a different zone, and trust that whatever the machine chooses, somehow as the artist, I guess I have created all these possibilities that I'm going to trust that there is a coherence with them when it is played. And there's a huge amount of trust in that. I remember going to see my first piece at the very end, and I think I said to you before that I can't experience this work until the very end of the process. It's actually incredibly stressful, because normally with the film you're seeing it all the time as you're building it. And just going down with my heart in my mouth thinking, God, is this even going to work at all? And I watched it for a few moments, make some decisions. And I felt its presence, actually. I felt, yeah, thank you, you're there, you're bigger than me, you're doing something else. And I recognize what I've done, but I'm having a direct human and machine experience. There's a lot of human in it, and then there's this open book of decision making, and that for me is very exciting, and there's a lot of freedom in that.
We spoke a lot about what the pitch process looks like, because in absence of a narrative premise, you're going in with a concept design for a project.
That's a good point. And I didn't answer your question about the script. Well, luckily I have a very trusting producer, and I just produced lots of, I had to sort of coordinate something that's more like a matrix of imagery and lists of what those will be, and there's sort of changes within them. So it's absolutely not a linear script, of course not, and there's no dialogue. But there's lots of reference points and descriptions and lists of what we're going to try to do, and there's always changes and hairpin bends and all kinds of the classic challenges. But
one of the visual layers is your cast, starting with Salma Hayek, and then there's an ensemble cast of dancers and others in the film. Can you talk about what your casting process was like? When did Salma come into the picture, so to say?
Yeah, of course. Well, again, coming from film, one of the, I guess, the main tools of the trade is, as a director and filmmaker, is working with actors. Is your talent, are the people up there on the screen for us to relate to? And there's an enormous human exchange with watching actors and stars, and what makes somebody a good actor, a great actor, and a star. Well, there are many components to that, but I think they throw out a charge, and we receive that charge. They have energy. There's the coordinates with the face they were born with, but something else too. Salma has all that, and I thought how exciting to see if I could bring into this practice something that's so much a part of my traditional practice, and work with someone who we can explore this world. It's not dialogue, but just give me these moments. I said in the talk yesterday, working in a studio. We shot her in a studio against green screen on a huge 4K on a Phantom Flex camera, so a lot of very high frame rate all the time, and that means that she's under pressure to bring these performances forth in a condensed period of time, a one-day shoot in this case. So you're just having that exchange and throwing ideas out and knowing that time is of the essence. But she was brilliant enough to discuss it with her before, discuss the ideas, discuss what we were trying to get at. We have audio playing to put her in the frame. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we just, off we go.
For a scene like this that I believe is yes, there it is. Does she know what environment she'll be placed in, or is this sort of the luck of the draw of the Unity game engine that's powering the scene and the film?
No, she didn't know, and I developed further ideas as we went. That's again the pleasure of this, is I could say, no, look at that. What if I could have this lovely, incredible freedom? But at the same time, there was the pipe, and we knew we were getting at this idea of expanded consciousness, possibly through in the landscape of plant medicines or psychoactive substances that can expand the imagination. So I'm sure that idea was in there, but quite what it was going to do or look like, because plenty of times the mushrooms don't appear either.
You mentioned playing a track on set, so music, compositions, to get the actors in the mood. Yeah. I was really taken away I spent more time with it downstairs during the lunch break, and the score is just, it's immaculate, but it feels so well paired with the scene at any given moment. And it's composed, so it's not a generative score. It's written by Magnus Fines, your brother. Can you speak a little bit about your collaboration?
Sure. Well, again, this funny thing that I've worked with my brother a lot for many years, from the get-go. And the great thing about Magnus is that I give him very little, and he just gets it. I guess there may even be a kind of synchronous energy of coming from the same DNA. I don't know, but I trust him, and he knew also. I think there's a lot of inspiration when you're giving someone creative free rein. Again, classically, there can be so much control and so much anxiety in the industry of filmmaking that you can erode the excitement and inspiration to make work. And so, yeah, Magnus delivered me a whole set of ideas and sketches, as he calls them, at the early stage of putting this together. There has to be so much trust, because, as I said, and you can't really experience it until the very end. And again, come back to this thing of my instinct is that it will be coherent. Now, I've spent so many hours in the edit as a filmmaker, and some of the best edits can come from those completely serendipitous moments where you kind of go to the editor, that was brilliant, and they went, oh yeah, I was just doing some house cleaning. It wasn't just bring me back that edit. So this idea of chance and serendipity, and so yeah, that trust is there, and it is phenomenal how coherent. Once there is a vision, definitely, and then there is this lovely sort of interesting surprise. And by the way, it's choosing tracks from at least at any one time a series of 4 or 5, but it does seem to hold itself.
Yeah, a few of us were actually wondering if the score was driving the visuals. So the software is rule-based, so I'm just wondering if you know offhand whether the score in some instances is actually dictating the visual selection.
No, I don't believe it is. But of course, having made this work, all I can think of was how exciting to do such and such in the next one. But no, it's the machine is my understanding, is making those so-called randomized selections. Yeah. And
in absence of a formal edit process, where you sit in, you review your selects, and make decisions together with a fellow human collaborator, I'm curious, did at any point, did you work with your team to revise the logic of this world that you were creating?
Sometimes, definitely, there'll be a point where I've put something in, and I'll just go, I can't tell you why, I hate that shot, it's just not working, definitely not, or can we please go back and make it? It's so instinctive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there are times when I will reverse out of my own decisions. But a lot this fundamental process is like a kind of big gathering that I have curated that, definitely. I'm curating, I come up with the thing, curating the gathering, and then throwing it out there and trusting all these choices and relationships that work. I want to say one other thing about control connected with the machine deciding. And I'm thinking, as the director, it's meant to be that you have all this control. But my gosh, you can't control an actor's performance. You can't control the specifically, necessarily, every last bit of the wardrobe department, or how the makeup is, or the talent might have done their own makeup and is overriding you. There's a lot that is actually completely the spontaneity of life, too, which is very much kind of a part of this process too. But sorry, I just skidded off a bit.
No. I'm glad that you brought it to this moment, because the word that comes to mind is encourage. You're encouraging your actors and your team to pursue a certain direction, but even with human collaborators, you can only get,
Totally, yeah.
Their work in some ways is, their output is ideally something better than you might have even imagined, right?
That often happens too. You're so right. You're sort of stimulating possibilities, and you're always in you're always in the present moment, and you're not in control of the future. You are stimulating realms of possibilities. But yeah, it's its own thing.
Yeah, I'm curious, we often talk about relinquishing power or some form of control, and I'm curious if in this process you felt that you acquired a superpower that you might not have otherwise had if you were working in a very traditional linear
That's
way.
A very clever way of looking at it, because as I said before, I felt this immense liberation working, I suppose, coming, technically speaking, from the classic film process and all those distribution kind of coordinates into the world, the new label of artist, and with this freedom of that individual having apparently that sort of position in it without being constrained by so many regulations. So even though I've, as you said, given so much trust in this way, I've also enjoyed the freedom, and I've also enjoyed the ability to give freedom too. And I think that creates really interesting energy.
On that note, I feel like time is of the essence, that we should see the work, because as a generative piece, it will never be the same. So as it's playing at the moment, right? There are scenes that may not come to fruition.
Well, the other thing is, of course, everyone that is my preoccupation is the audience, their encounter. I mean, that you all come and you're going to see, because of your day, you will see snippets, you'll see the bits that you chose to see. And that is a moment of synchronicity between your exchange with it and whatever it was playing at that time with whatever track. So yeah, you will see repeat sections, there are definitely, but it's the full context of those sections is also kind of an unknown to people's lives and their moment of engagement.
Mm-hmm. A metaphor that we've used to compare the film is actually, it's very similar to a painting or a tableau, a tapestry, in that in some ways the work really changes with each person's perception and read of it. You can find yourself in certain scenes, and if you come back to it at a different moment, you may take away a very different read of it. Yeah,
it's deliberately, you're not bound by time and the length of the film that will always be the same when played, so that's very much a part of it, so that has those freedoms for meaning. And I guess, I tried to say at one point, this is more like, I guess, if film is prose, this is more like poetry. There is a shift in the nature of the medium. And I've sort of joked that a lot of film, great TV and great film, which of course is this superlatively exciting medium, is also quite mind-controlling. There's a lot of very specific manipulation of, and we all come to accept that. But I also think there's another part of the human structure that isn't just working at the practical reality of what happens next. There's a soul, there's a mind, body, spirit complex, there's a subconscious mind, and I like to explore this idea in my head anyway, that there's room when you encounter it to make decisions about how you feel about it. It's not boxing you in and trying to control your emotions too much, but perhaps stimulate.
Well, we're incredibly lucky to have you working at the intersection of film and using technology in this way to create these experiences. So
honored to be here.
Thank you for bringing the film to Christie's.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Claris, and I'll be talking to you a bit about the law. I think I'd like to step back in time and sort of see how art has been recognized as a work, as a protectable copyright. From the 1500s, you see the artist here painting a painting. He used a brush, as we heard earlier, like Jackson Pollock, kind of sending out the sprays of paint onto a canvas. Artists have used tools to help them create work forever, whether it's an artist with a paintbrush or it's an author today with Microsoft Word. It took until the 1800s for the camera to come into play, and that was the first machine that came between the artist and the work. And at the time, the Supreme Court had to opine on whether a work that was generated out of a camera was copyrightable. Because if it was generated by a machine, was there an author, and could it therefore be protected? And in 1848, the court held that the artist can have a machine like a camera be a part of the creation, and yet still the artist, the photographer in that case, would own the copyright. So the question, the big question that kind of comes up in artificial intelligence, and the question that I'd like to address here is artificial intelligence, from a legal point of view, a misnomer? Like we heard from Mike earlier, there's always an artist who's somewhat involved in the creation. Yet it looks like we're on a collision course with that kind of paradigm, if in fact the AI creates the work and there really is no creation by an author. And at what point is something perfectly machine generated? So here, with those old cameras, we know that photographers had to adjust the light and develop the film. There was a lot of artistry that went into it. Lately, you can have a camera where a monkey can take its own selfie. And here, this monkey picked up a camera, took a picture, and the photographer, even though the monkey pushed the button, the photographer believed the photograph was his. PETA sued him, saying that no, the monkey took the photograph, and therefore the monkey owned the copyright. The court held that no, an animal can't own copyright. An animal can't enforce its own rights. It's a human must be involved in the creation. They never ultimately decided whether that photographer owned the photograph, but because the case went away. But we know now that monkeys cannot own copyrights. So what does that mean in terms of artificial intelligence? Can a machine own a copyright? And if not, who does? So before I get to that, there are these two concepts in copyright: hard work and originality. For a long time, people thought that the harder you work, like Velázquez painting that painting, had a lot to do with whether you owned a copyright. But the Supreme Court held about 20 years ago that it's really not about how hard you work. It's really about the originality that you put into the work. And so originality for copyright needs only be minimal in order for you to get the copyright. You can do the simplest thing, maybe put a toilet on the wall and still get a copyright in that sculpture. And so when we're talking about whether copyright applies, we really only look to originality. We don't look to how hard you work. So back to the Constitution. The Constitution said, this is the copyright clause, and this is where it all kind of started. And it talks about promoting the progress of science, science being things like writing, photography, art, by securing for limited times to authors. Authors are defined as any creator, whether you're a sculptor, a painter, a software engineer, the exclusive right to their respective writings. Writings being now defined very broadly as any creative work. So why did the Constitution have a copyright clause? One would argue that the founders wanted to promote the creation of art, right? And how do you promote it? You need to give somebody a monopoly over that work for a period of time in order to monetize it, to make a living on it, because nobody makes art without getting paid. So when you've got artificial intelligence, the question is there any kind of, does the fundamental policy around the Constitution of promoting the progress of science apply when it's a purely machine-generated work? A machine doesn't need to be incentivized. It doesn't need to be promoted. All it needs to do is be turned on, one could argue. So does the artificial intelligence intrusion into this world change, again, the paradigm of promoting the works of art? Now, the alternative of copyright is that works that are created by, say, purely machine-generated or by a monkey could potentially be defined as in the public domain, as just something that is created and contributed to all of us. Because ultimately, copyright is for a limited time because the world ought to have the benefit of the works ultimately. They fall into the public domain so that we can enjoy them. The Velázquez painting is no longer covered by copyright, even though the physicality of it can be exchanged one person to one person. Anybody can make a copy of that painting. So we have now this question, and I think you've heard a number of times in prior talks, what is a tool versus what is this artificial intelligence? A tool being Adobe Photoshop, being a keyboard that when you push a button, a horn comes out or a violin comes out. We all know that everybody who works in the arts is supplemented, is aided by tools. And so is, again, artificial intelligence a misnomer here? Are we using that term because it's got some market appeal, but in fact, there's always the artist behind the scenes? So why don't we look at a quick video. This is right in the middle of Her, the movie that came out some years ago about a guy who bought a phone which had an AI operating system voiced by Scarlett Johansson, and she got to know him so well that she started to help him out. And I think this is instructive in terms of where we're capable of going. And think about this in terms of copyright. Who is the author of what we're talking about in this clip? He's a writer of letters. And the letters are, he writes on behalf of other people to send to friends and family. But he's always wished for the day that he could potentially put together a book of his favorite letters and publish them as a book. And so the question, but he never quite got to it. And he's voiced his frustration to the Scarlett Johansson character, the operating system. And so she comes back to him.
Oh my God.
What?
I just got an email for you. I have something I want to tell you. It's a big surprise.
What?
Okay. Well, I've been going through all of your old letters and compiling them down into my favorites. And a couple weeks ago, I sent them to a publisher, Crown Point Press. I know you like what they do and that they still print books.
Wait, what? You did what?
Can I read you the letter that we just got back from them?
I don't know. Okay, well, just, is it good or bad?
It's good. It's good. It's really good. It's good. Okay? Listen. Dear Theodore Twombly, actually, I sent it from you. Dear Theodore Twombly, I've just finished reading your letters. Twice, actually. I was so moved by them, I shared them with my wife when I got home. Many made us laugh, some brought us to tears, and in all of them, we found something of ourselves. The selections you made flow so well as a complete piece. I did that. I've taken the liberty of laying these out in a mock-up, and we're posting it to your address. We'd love to meet with you and move forward. Yours, Michael Wadsworth.
Okay, so the question is, who's the author here? Is it the operating system that has gone ahead and learned from him and put together the book of compilation letters, because that is a separate copyright? Or is it Joaquin Phoenix? Or is it Apple? Or who owns that copyright, right? And nobody's really quite answered this, and this is obviously science fiction to a certain extent, but not so far off as we've seen today. And so I think that one could argue that he's using the phone as a tool. He's training the tool is working with him, and ultimately he owns the copyright. If you argue that the operating system is operating independently and it's purely machine generated, then we have no copyright, and I'll show you what the US Copyright Office has said about that. And if you argue that that Apple or the engineer that created the algorithm owns the copyright, then you're basically giving the copyright to Adobe Photoshop rather than to the party who's utilizing it, right? So that can't possibly be the case, one would argue. So let's look at one more example of an avatar builder. And this builder, it doesn't have any sound. I'll talk while it's going, but you'll watch that as you build your avatar, and this is a user interface on the internet, you're able to make any number of selections and choices and turn knobs and make filters and colors and you know, skin color and hair and all sorts of decisions. You can spend hours and days on your avatar. And as you build your avatar, you make it into exactly what you'd like it to be. It might represent you. It might represent what you'd like you to be. It might represent something else. However you'd like that avatar to play in the world, it can do so. And so here you are doing the two things that we talked about earlier. You're committing hard work, and you're creating what one could argue is an original work of art. And so if hard work is really not part of the equation, then is originality. And so here you're on somebody else's website creating your avatar to fit your needs with all your own formula applied. Who's the author? Is anybody? Is it the company that makes that available? Is it you who's spending all your time and originality tweaking all the buttons? Or is it nobody? And what happens if you can take that avatar, if it's yours, because you spent a lot of time on it, can you take that avatar and move it from platform to platform? Can you argue that the company that made it available to you has no right to it whatsoever, and that it should give it to you? Can you use it to go shopping in the future world or to make new books for you? Any number of things are possible if you are the copyright holder. Now, as of right now, the United States has taken a pretty hard line on whether the kinds of works that are purely machine generated are copyrightable. And they say they will not register works produced by a machine or mere mechanical process that operates randomly or automatically without any creative input or intervention from a human author. Again, author is defined as any number of creative types. So obviously there's a lot of catches in that sentence, right? Without any creative input or intervention. What does that mean? For example, let's say you've created an algorithm today that can create works, the GANs, the kinds of outputs that we've talked about here, the generative software that we all know, and in 1 year, that generates a new work. Is the temporality, is the distance between you and that new work meaningful? Does it matter whether you have the pen or the paintbrush in your hand and you're creating the work immediately? Or can you have created the algorithm today and it generates something a year, 2 years, 10 years from now, and just because you're not temporally connected to it, does that mean you're not the artist? And that goes to the question of whether the algorithm builder, the person who's made these algorithms and has put them into the market, is the party who should be considered the author. One might argue that if you don't have incentives to promote the science of creation, and algorithm builders like we just saw Mike Tyrer talk about, if a guy like that can't have a copyright in the works that he's generating, then why would he go ahead and spend all of his time making these kinds of things other than by pure charity? We need to promote artists to create algorithms and to innovate through engineering and artistry in order to have protectable works in the community. And so here, the question is whether without any creative input or intervention is defined as you need to be involved with it today, immediately, that you're involved with the output that it happens? Or is it okay if you can say, I created this algorithm today, or 5 years ago, and today it created the work? To be determined. However, other countries have already begun to opine on this. And the interesting thing is that in the UK and other countries like the UK, like Ireland and India, they say that machine-generated works, purely machine-generated works, are copyrightable. Australia has said, like the United States, it's not, and other countries are following suit. Japan and the European Union each have rules that don't give purely machine-generated works copyright. However, they are reconsidering their positions. And they're beginning to have conferences and talks about how they can fit their copyright law to meet with the new AI innovations. Really productive. However, the United States to date, because of this fairly straightforward statement by the Copyright Office that we just read, is not doing much of anything in terms of thinking about whether machine-generated works should be copyrightable and whether that statement should be in any way made a little bit more subtle, a little bit more developed, so that we understand what the role of whom in that creative process is and who gets the work, the copyright. So before we end, I wanted to step back a little bit and talk about the training data that goes into the things like GANs that we've all talked about so much. Because machine learning and copyright is a key question to whether the kinds of work that we've seen happen here can happen without the possibility of being sued for copyright infringement. So you've all seen this slide. it's a really nice way to describe a generative adversarial network. I'm not going to focus on it from the artistic point of view or from the technical point of view, but from a copyright point of view. When you have a lot of in-copyright works, anything that was created from 1923 to the present, and you scan them, you scrape them, you aggregate them, you take them from the internet, you put them into your training data as a way to give your software the ability to know what's real and what's fake, you're committing copyright infringement. I ask here, is training data copyright infringement? Well, one could argue yes, right? You're taking copies without permission. You're taking potentially millions of images, of paintings, of sculptures, of whatever it is that your software is using, and you're committing copyright infringement unless you get permission or unless you use only public domain works, which is really hard. So the question, though, is perhaps it's copyright infringement, but is it fair use? Have you a defense against copyright infringement because you're using the works in a transformative way? What does transformative mean? You're taking a work that may have otherwise hung on a wall or been on a website, and you're using it for a new purpose, which is to train your algorithm. No case has really come down in any country that I know of to decide whether training data is copyright infringement, and even if it is, whether there's a fair use to it. However, there is a case that is really interesting. It's the Google Books case. It had to do with scanning 3 million books by Google, not to have people read the book online, but to have them find the book online. In that case, the transformativeness was, I need to find it, I don't want to read it. If I find it, I will perhaps read it, and that'll be good for the authors. The authors sued, and they said, Google's copying my entire book without my permission. I don't want them to do it. And yet, the court held that they were permitted to do so. So Google was permitted to scan 3 million books without permission. Maybe you, as artists, can do so as well. I hope so. I would certainly advise that that would be the case. So last point, scraping, aggregating, and terms of service. Many people are taking, as I said, millions of images off the web. You can do so, but there's always a question whether the terms of service, the site that you go to, prohibits that, or it makes you need to enter your name and password. And it has terms of service that say, do not scrape, do not copy, do not use for training data. So those are the kinds of contractual obligations that one might face when in the world of creating training sets. And so those things all have to be thought about on a case-by-case basis, but something definitely to think about outside of what the Copyright Act says, or what the Constitution says, or what public policy says, or what the UK says. So my time is up. Thank you very much.
My name's Jason Bailey. I have a blog called Art Gnome, where I write about the intersection of art and technology. I'm super excited to be here today with my favorite AI artist, Robbie Barrett. So Robbie's a super remarkable young man who's managed to accomplish more than twice as much as I have in half as many years. So
not at all.
Lucky to have him here today. So among his more recent accomplishments, so Robbie, actually, we had a couple of people ask when self-driving cars will be ready. Robbie worked for a self-driving car company for a while.
Yeah.
How long, Robbie, before we have self-driving cars?
I worked at NVIDIA working on self-driving cars for about a year, like the AI side. Personally, I think that self-driving cars are really boring. And I think that we should be using AI instead of taping cameras onto the side of cars. I think we should be using AI for I don't know, something like city design, maybe to design a city where you don't need cars, because one of the reasons that getting around the city sucks is because we have so many roads and so many traffic jams. So, bit of an unpopular opinion here at the Christie's and Hyundai show, but but it is what it is.
Yeah, no, I love it. So Robbie had a little bit of a hiccup getting into college. He's now going to college in Nantes.
Yeah, and I got into an art school in France that I'll be going to in a few months, finally. I've been out of high school for 2 years, floating around, trying to get into college and getting rejected from most places. So it's a big relief to, finally get in somewhere.
Yeah, so the way I like to tell it is that Stanford didn't accept you as a student, but you lectured at Stanford,
Yeah,
right?
and I worked in a research lab there. But no hard feelings. I mean, the admission system is a machine.
Yep, it's true. And then there's this excellent documentary out called Science Fair. So when Robbie was in high school, he was in the International Science Fair 2 years in a row, and he's one of the main characters that they follow around in this award-winning documentary. And like National Geographic flew you around, right? To
Yeah,
do
it
all
was
these shows.
really fun.
Yeah. So super accomplished guy. I think what I'd like to do in this conversation, there's an analogy I use a lot with why I think people have a hard time understanding how AI art works. So I think, even if you've never made a painting before, when you go to a museum or a gallery and you see a painting, you have some concept of how that painting was created, right? So there's a paintbrush and there's some pigment and there's a canvas, and it's a lot more nuanced than that, but it's like a core mechanic that you understand. And I think the average person actually has no idea how machine learning and GANs work. And we've had some decent descriptions of GANs throughout the day, but maybe if we could have you walk through some of your work and kind of talk about process. I think personally, I'm a huge AI art fan and a collector. And I think for me, the exciting part is the nuance between the different AI artists, but we never get to that conversation because people are so obsessed with like robots and things that are completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
So why don't we go through some of your work, and maybe that's the best way to kind of describe the process and the role that you play in making it.
Yeah, so this is some of my work on landscapes, and it was produced with a type of neural network, a generative adversarial network. So, I mean, without going into like the technical, well, I mean, we can. But basically, I'd like to talk more about my role in the creation of it. I mean, I'm not just, like a robot tamer with this robot that spits out paintings, and then I, will control, how fast it spits them out. I mean, it's really an intimate artistic process that I have with this network, and it's not, I mean, the machine does not really have any agency. It's not doing anything creative. I mean, I'm using it as a tool strictly. So basically, what I did was, I curated a big data set of landscape paintings, and I fed them into the generative adversarial neural network, the GAN, and I tried to get it to learn how to produce more landscape paintings. And then once it learns that, I decide how much it learns when it stops learning, and then it's my job to curate the outputs again. So I mean, like, I'm a curator really with this, and I'm sort of producing these landscapes with the network. If we could go to the next slide. So I mean, you'll notice that these, depending on how into landscape paintings you are good or bad, but I mean, I was not satisfied with them at all because we already have landscape paintings, and it's kind of boring to train a very complex machine to just make more of what people have been painting for, probably 1,000 years. So I did some tricks to try and, get the network to make less realistic landscape paintings, more interesting ones. This is one of them, so is the next one. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's really just like more abstract landscape paintings. So I wanted to move on. So I started to produce nude portraits, which I think is next. Yes. So this is a neural network that I trained on a very classical data set of nude portraits. And I sort of interrupted the learning process a bit to confuse the machine. And I don't like the word confuse because it is a little bit like, anthropomorphizing it. But I interrupted the learning process to ensure that the GAN would only learn the very low-level features of nude portraits, like fat, folds of flesh, breasts, but not the high-level overarching structure of things. So can I have the clicker, actually? No offense.
No worries.
But yeah, so it makes stuff like this. Oh wait, we've moved on too quickly.
See, I gave you the clicker for like 2 seconds.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this sort of machine misinterpretation of nude portraits is really interesting, especially because we as people are like very, very almost like hypersensitive to like the nude body. I mean, if something is off about a landscape, we won't really notice it. But if something's off about the human body that we're seeing, it freaks us out a little bit. And I think that's really, really interesting to explore, this sort of misinterpretation or miscommunication between, me and this tool that I'm using. I think that's what makes it interesting. And also the misinterpretation, I try to make it a central part of a lot of my projects. This is some work that I did with fashion images that I scraped from Balenciaga's website. So they're a luxury brand. But I was on their website and I noticed that it looked a lot like a data set. So I wrote a script to download all the images from their like for sale section and also some runway photos. And it makes these really weird misinterpretations of Balenciaga. And you might just think that, oh, it looks like low quality Balenciaga. But you'll notice little things like that woman on the far left is just holding like what seems to be like a piece of cloth or a tassel instead of a bag. And if we can skip forward one more slide. It made this, which I thought was super interesting. It always sees people holding bags right next to their shins, and it doesn't understand about, it only has visual context to go off of. So it made this shin bag thing, and I sent this to one of my friends, Mushba, who's a designer, and he made a physical version of it. I think we have a slide of this, right?
I don't think we do.
Sorry.
I own a pair. I should have worn them.
Yeah. I should have worn mine too, but we made like 50, and it was really fun, and it was like a wraparound shin bag. So yeah, my work with misinterpretation and all that, it's what I've been doing. But especially with the fashion work, it seemed to be incomplete. There's a difference between like images of paintings and images of outfits, where you want like a human designer to work with to make those outfits physical. It feels incomplete almost only dealing with it feels like almost like half of a process. So. A lot of my work, we had a show last February in Paris. I was working in confrontation in collaboration with French painter Renan Barreau. We had a show called Infinite Skulls through Avant Galerie Vossen. And basically, this was a collaboration. So Renan is a French painter, and he will paint scenes, and I really love his work, and I deeply admire him. But every time he will interrupt a painting or finish a painting, he'll use the leftover paint on his palette to paint a skull. And the left image is one of his skulls, and he has thousands of these. And that's perfect for me to work with because I'm working with these very data-hungry algorithms. So for the very first part of our show, I showed up in Paris. Actually, he didn't know that I was showing up until like the day before. So in a lot of the times that we speak about this in interviews, he refers to me as like the uninvited guest in the studio. But I trained a neural network to try and make more skulls. He has been priding himself on the fact that he has so many of these skull paintings, and then the neural network can just spit out a near infinite amount in like a day. So we had this big conversation about stuff like the infinitude of generative systems, the machine like misinterpreting. If you can move forward on the slides. Yeah, this is just another duet. But towards the end of our confrontation or collaboration, I started to feed in his skulls to the machine, like all rotated, to try and sort of, because the skulls that the machine was making were too similar to his. So all rotated around, it makes more abstract images like this. So I thought that was more interesting because they're different than the source material, but they are only learning from the source material. And we had a few installations in that show where like one was like a box where you would look in it, and you would press a button and it would generate a skull image and display it on a screen for 7 seconds. And then it would erase it and it would be gone forever. So you'd look into this box and you'd see a skull that like you will be the first person to see and the last person to see ever, because it ensures it'll never make the same image twice. So we did installations like that. But it's not pictured here, but another thing that he'd do is he would correct my work. He would not be satisfied with the AI generations, he'd just paint directly over it. So that's what my recent work is about, the corrections that I'm doing. So this is a correction of a Peter Paul Rubens painting. And I say correction in the sense, so it's not like I'm like setting out to like correct or improve on Peter Paul Rubens. That's ridiculous. But what it's like is so in Renan's studio, I noticed that he corrects his own paintings when he's not satisfied with them. He'll obscure an area and then fill it back in. So I'm basically teaching the neural network to do that over and over again, of obscuring an area, filling it back in, and then what it's doing in this process is it's like slowly adjusting these images to better fit the neural network's internal idea of what like nude portraits looked like. It's trained on all nude bodies and how to like reconstruct like little missing chunks of those. So it's correct purely in the eyes of the neural network. But yeah, these are a few of those images. And that's what I've been working on more recently. I really want to work with Renan again on something like this. But yeah, that's my most recent work.
Yeah, no, I love these. These are great. Yeah, I think the first work that
this one's really good.
Saw from you, so this is a sequence, right?
Yeah.
We go from this one.
So that's uncorrected, and then that's what it looks like corrected.
And then there's a third one.
Yeah, so this is where I was manually controlling what area of the painting is, the neural network is correcting.
Yeah, I think when I first saw your nudes was when I first discovered your work on Twitter, and it just looked like something that I had never seen before. So there's a lot of AI work that was kind of like in the style transfer vein that just didn't do it for me art-wise. I mean, it's neat tech-wise, but I think your early nudes were particularly interesting to me. So there's this tweet that I want to reference that you sent out.
Okay, go ahead.
The other day. Let's see. Okay. Please stop making disgusting projects where you train a neural network and give it a name and pretend it's an artist and then try to use it as a component of a money generation machine.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of, in this like AI art, I guess, sphere, a lot of people are, very, I mean, it just makes a better headline when you say, robots are making art rather than artists are using parts of machine learning as part of an intimate artistic process. I mean, it's just much more flashy to say robots are making art. So, I mean, I feel like, and a lot of people in like the creative community have started, making like painting robots and giving them like human faces and like wigs and stuff. And it's just ridiculous because, I mean, the machine is not the artist at all. And I mean, I think that these are just sort of very cheap attention grabs. I mean, there's no way that you could work with neural networks, extensively and then, think that, they're doing something like highly creative or that they're like, have a mind of their own. I mean, they're tools. So yeah, I mean, I was pretty disappointed with that. So we'll see how it turns out. But yeah, if you're thinking about doing something like that, when putting a wig on a robot and getting it to paint, don't do that.
So who are some of your big influences artistically?
So, I mean, I find that I don't really, I mean, when I'm looking for work that like really like makes me like feel like something in my gut, like really strong work, I find that a lot of the times it's not work made by other AI artists. It's usually very, very traditional painters like a Peter Paul Rubens or the French painter that I collaborated with, Ronan Barreau. I mean, there's this very sort of, I mean, not necessarily like super classical, but I mean, there's something that I feel is very like, honorable almost about being a very traditional artist and making your art with basically what is like a stick and some pigment instead of, working with a very complex machine like I do. I mean, I'm a little bit jealous of traditional artists for that reason. So, I mean, I guess a lot of my favorite work is by them. But in terms of more contemporary, I think Namjoon Paik is definitely my favorite artist of all time. I mean, what he thought, if you look at his quotes about what he thought like the TV. He thought it was going to be like every artist would have a TV station, and you'd be able to sit down at your TV and you'd be able to watch like any channel on the whole planet. And I just think that is like such a fantastic vision. And I think that a lot of what he was talking about the television and technology aiding artists and serving to like make just artistic processes easier. And he would also make art through the TV. I think that what's happening. What he thought was going to happen with the TV is now happening with computers and maybe machine learning, which I'm really excited about.
Awesome. So I think, I know you said maybe you wanted to open it up for some questions. I guess one last question for me. On this sort of twofold question around open sourcing code and also attribution. So with software art, it gets really murky in terms of how far down do you attribute credit to? Do you give credit to the graphics card maker, or to if you use someone's code, like, do you have to give credit? How do you think about that in terms of attribution and its impact on open source?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very tricky. So, I mean, I grew up in West Virginia, so I mean, I learned from open source. It's not like I could go, to the nearby like AI company and work with them or intern with them. So I mean, I learned everything from the internet and from open source, and because of that, I mean, I have been, I mean, not super recently, but I have been making a lot of my work open source. There was sort of an incident last fall where Christie's auctioned off a painting for $500,000 that was generated with a toolkit that I made open source and some networks that I trained to try and make machine learning and art more accessible, where basically they did not credit me and I was not mentioned and I didn't get any of the money. But I mean, what they did wasn't like legally wrong, but it, it's kind of morally a little bit gray because I mean, I'm trying to make like a nice like resource, and then they basically use it to do exactly what I already did and then sell it for $500,000.
Well, they did put it in a gold frame, Robbie.
True, yeah, they did. And they also did sign it with Ian Goodfellow's GAN algorithm with a pen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm being sarcastic. I don't think that really warrants much. But anyways, so I mean, I think that open source is really important, and I'm gonna keep doing it. I just need to be more careful about how I do it. You know, I mean, I was 17 when I put that thing up. I put like basically my whole project up. So I mean, I guess I kind of deserve it in that sense. But I mean, I'm gonna probably put components that I felt helped me, you know, up as open source, because I mean, you know, making this more accessible is great. You know, I mean, I think that something is lost when the only people who can make art with AI are like white tech bros in Silicon Valley with huge fancy computers. I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, usually when you think like more traditional mediums, like, you know, like white tech bros with huge fancy computers don't make the most interesting art usually. So, I mean, I think it would be nice to see a wider range of people, you know, have access to these things. And I would really like to see that through open source and through like, you know, freedom of resources and education, rather than, you know, like a paid service or something.
But when people take other people's code, tweak it, put their name on there,
yeah,
it
it's like it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'd love to open it up. I don't know that we're necessarily wired for audience questions, but if you can talk loud, if someone's got a question, it looks like we've got. Oh, is that the person with the microphone? Any questions for Robbie? If not, I'll ask more. Any questions? I can't really see.
We have one.
You got one? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I am really interested in the open source situation here. I am really interested in the open source situation here, and I've posed this question a few times. If you could come up with any type of solution, what would you envision? Like, would it be just a kind of like a group of developers, just like worldwide, kind of coming together and figuring out what that would look like when you have open source and people are making money off of it in the end? And you would be the best person to answer this, given it happened to you.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are, you know, licenses where you can put a license on your project. I didn't do this because I was 17, but yeah, I mean, there are some licenses that say, like, you know, non-commercial. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, one part of me, you know, thinks that's a good solution, and then one part of me, you know, would kind of hate if everybody embraced open source finally, but it was all under like heavy licenses, you know. So I really don't know. I think that, I mean, we just need more people involved in open source, and then maybe we can see how it goes from there. I mean, I can't really give you a definite answer though. Sorry.
But it's clearly broken the way it is, right?
I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there weren't.
You ask how I sell my work or how I display it.
Oh yeah, that was a good question, right? Yeah. So
I have strong feelings on this.
Yeah. So Robbie, how do you think about how you display and sell your work?
So, I mean, I think about this a lot. So, I mean, a lot of digital artists really like to print their work out. And I mean, I did some of this for the Renan show, but just so you know, he could paint on top of it or interact with it. But I mean, even then, it was printed on plexiglass with a backlight in it, so it sort of looked like a screen. I feel very strongly that digital work should remain digital. I don't think that, you know, you should, you know, I mean, if you think about my process, I'm looking at a computer screen, I'm making work digitally, and you know, I work on it, I refine it digitally all through the screen, and then at the very last step before I show it to everybody else, I'll transform it, I'll put it onto a piece of canvas, or, you know, God forbid, I'll get a painting robot to make a painting of it. I mean, I just think that that's like, just so, I mean, it ruins it. I mean, it's digital work. It would be like if I sat down and I spent years painting a painting, and then I scanned it in a computer and then put it on Twitter as like a 600 pixel JPEG. You know?
Right.
I mean, it's just like a very needless transformation, and I think that we should not be trying to just sort of impersonate what people have been doing for hundreds of years because, you know, it's the art market, like paintings sell. I think that, you know, you can do more interesting things with digital work than you can with, you know, paintings on a canvas, I feel, or prints on a canvas. So I really do like to keep my work digital. So, I mean, when I do sell it, I only sell it in a gallery setting, but usually I'll just sell like prepared televisions, sort of like Namjoon Paik stuff, where it will be a CRT television with like a little driving board that's constantly displaying the work, or even better, a computer that actually contains the neural network constantly like running, and then the output is pumped onto the screen. So I think that, I mean, you know, I guess that's a little bit strong. I mean, most people would easily settle for prints, but I think that it's a really important distinction that needs to be made.
It's a huge part of how your work is ultimately displayed.
Yeah.
I think we're out of time, but
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah,
I
thank
thought that
you.
was really good. Yeah.
So hi, I'm Ben Fino-Radin, and I'm